Don't sign that tomorrow, or everything you built will start dying piece by piece." The words didn't echo loudly, but they cut through the low hum of crystal glasses and quiet laughter like something sharp and invisible, forcing a few heads at the long mahogany table to turn, just slightly, just enough to notice the woman standing near the wall with a tray still balanced in her steady hands. Ava Brooks didn't move closer, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there in the soft golden spill of chandelier light, her dark eyes fixed on Richard Halston, a man worth over $4 billion, seated at the center like gravity itself bent around him, his cufflinks catching the light every time he moved his wrist, his smile polished, effortless, practiced, the kind that closed deals before words even began. He didn't look at her at first, not really, just the faintest flicker of acknowledgement before he turned back to his guests. Men in tailored suits and women with voices like quiet velvet, all of them waiting for his reaction, for his lead, because that was how this room worked, how every room worked when Richard Halston walked into it. Control wasn't asserted, it was assumed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, not to her, but to the table, his tone smooth, almost amused. "Did someone say something?" A soft ripple of laughter followed, polite, contained, practiced just like everything else in the room. But Ava didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze. She shifted the tray slightly in her hands, the faint clink of glass against glass marking her presence in a way words hadn't. And this time, when Richard looked up, really looked, there was a pause, brief but real, like something in her stillness refused to be dismissed as easily as the uniform she wore. "You're about to sign with Virex Global," she said, her voice calm, measured, every word placed with care. "And there's a clause buried in their liability structure that transfers long-term exposure back to your firm after 12 months. It's designed to look like protection, but it's not." The air shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle tightening across the table, a glance exchanged here, a slight lean forward. There, because even in rooms built on ego, risk had a way of being heard. Richard's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, just enough to harden at the edges. "That's a very specific observation," he said, setting his glass down with quiet precision, especially from someone who wasn't invited to the conversation. Another ripple of laughter, this one sharper, more certain, restoring the balance that had almost slipped. Ava inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, like she had already calculated this moment and accepted the cost. "I wasn't invited," she replied, "but I understood what I heard." Silence didn't fall, not completely, but it thinned, stretched tight between expectation and dismissal. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creasing under his weight, his gaze settling on her now with full attention, not curiosity, not yet respect, but something closer to evaluation, as if deciding how much of this moment deserved to exist. "And what exactly?" he asked, voice quieter now, colder. "Do you think you understand about a deal my legal team has spent 6 months structuring?" The chandelier light flickered faintly against the glassware, reflections shifting across the table like something unstable just beneath the surface. Ava didn't answer immediately, and in that breath of hesitation, the room chose its side, attention drifting back to Richard, to certainty, to power, because uncertainty, especially from someone like her, didn't belong here, and yet she remained, unmoved, as if the outcome she saw had already begun unfolding, whether anyone else was ready to see it or not. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like a string pulled too far but not yet snapped, and Ava could feel it in the way the air shifted around her, in the subtle turn of shoulders, in the quiet dismissal that moved faster than words ever could. Richard Halston did not raise his voice. He did not need to power like his rarely did. Instead, he reached for his glass again, slow, deliberate, as if the conversation had already ended in his mind, as if her presence had already been erased. "Understanding is not the same as relevance," he said calmly, his eyes no longer searching, hers but gliding past her as though she were part of the room's decor, polished, silent, replaceable. A few guests nodded, not because they agreed, but because agreement was the currency that kept them seated at that table, and no one there was willing to risk their place over a warning that came from someone they had not even noticed 10 minutes earlier. Ava felt the weight of that truth press against her chest, not as fear, but as something heavier, something familiar. She had seen this before, in classrooms where her answers were overlooked until repeated by someone else, in offices where her ideas floated unheard until they returned wearing a different face. This was not new. What was new was the scale of the consequence. She shifted her grip on the tray, steady, controlled, and took a single step forward, not enough to challenge the space, just enough to exist within it. It becomes relevant when it costs you everything, she said quietly, and this time, the words did not disappear. They lingered, not because of their volume, but because of the certainty behind them. One of the men at the table glanced down at his tablet, fingers moving almost instinctively, searching, verifying, a habit formed from years of surviving rooms exactly like this. Richard noticed the movement, his gaze flicking briefly before returning to Ava, and for a fraction of a second, something in his expression shifted. Not doubt, not yet, but awareness that the moment had not fully bent to his control. "Do you know how many warnings I hear in a week?" he said, his tone still smooth but edged now with something colder, something sharper. Analysts, advisors, competitors, all convinced they see something no one else does. And yet here I am. He spread his hand slightly. The room, the table, the quiet attention orbiting him like proof, still standing. A few soft chuckles followed, lighter this time, more cautious, as if even they were unsure how firmly the ground beneath them held. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. And how many of them understood the structure well enough to explain it in one sentence? She replied, her voice steady. The liability is delayed, not removed. It transfers after the public reporting window closes, which means the damage will not appear until it is too late to contain. The man with the tablet paused, his brow tightening, his screen reflecting faint lines of text that seemed suddenly more important than the conversation itself. Richard saw it. Of course he did. He saw everything in his rooms. That was how he had built what he had. But seeing was not the same as accepting, and acceptance required something he was not prepared to give. Not here. Not now. Not to her. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against the table, his voice dropping just enough to draw the room back under his control. "You are out of line," he said, not loudly, but with a finality that carried more weight than any raised voice could. "This is not your place." The words landed with precision, clean, controlled, designed to restore order, and around him, the room exhaled, tension dissolving into something more comfortable, more familiar. Because hierarchy had been re-established, Ava felt it, the closing of the moment, the decision made not on facts, but on who was allowed to present them. She held his gaze for one last second, long enough to confirm what she already knew, that he would not hear her, not now, maybe not ever, and then she stepped back, the faint sound of her shoes against the polished floor barely audible, her presence folding back into the edges of the room where it had always been expected to remain. But the words she had spoken did not disappear. They lingered in the quiet spaces between glances, in the screen of a tablet still open beneath the table, in the subtle shift of a deal that, for the first time that evening, no longer felt completely certain. The music resumed, soft and measured, as if the room itself had decided to forget what had just happened. Forks lifted, glasses clinked. Conversation returned in fragments that tried too hard to sound natural. But beneath the surface something had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a hairline crack in polished glass. Ava moved along the perimeter with quiet precision, refilling water, clearing plates. Her presence once again reduced to motion and function. But her mind did not return to stillness. It remained fixed on the structure she had heard, the phrasing, the timing, the deliberate placement of risk just beyond visibility. She had studied deals like this before, late nights in a small apartment with secondhand textbooks and a laptop that overheated after 20 minutes. Long before she traded internships for hourly shifts and conference rooms for service hallways. She knew the pattern, not because she was told, but because she had learned to see what others overlooked. And tonight it had been clear, too clear to ignore. Across the table, the man with the tablet had not closed it. His screen dimmed slightly, but his fingers hovered, hesitating, as if caught between loyalty and instinct. He glanced once toward Richard, then back down, scrolling, slower now, more deliberate, the kind of movement that came from doubt. Richard noticed again, Of course he did. His awareness did not fade just because the moment had passed. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharper now, tracking, calculating, adjusting. Control was not something he lost. It was something he recalibrated. Everything satisfactory, he asked the table lightly, his tone inviting agreement. And it came, quickly, almost too quickly, a chorus of reassurance that restored the rhythm he expected, but it did not reach everyone. The man with the tablet cleared his throat softly, a small sound that did not belong in a room like this, and for a second, no one spoke. There is a timing element in the liability clause, he said carefully, choosing each word like it might cost him something. It does shift exposure beyond the first reporting cycle. The sentence did not accuse, it did not confirm, it simply existed, and that was enough. The air tightened again. Thinner now, sharper. Richard's gaze moved to him, slow, deliberate, not angry, not yet, but focused, like a spotlight narrowing. "And does that concern you?" he asked, his voice even, controlled, but carrying weight beneath it. The man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second too long. "It depends on how the secondary protections are structured," he replied, deflecting just enough to survive. Richard nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, then lifted his glass again, signaling closure without saying the word, and the room followed, because that was what rooms like this did. They followed. Ava watched it all from the edge, the choreography of power restoring itself, the truth acknowledged just enough to be buried again, and she understood then that this was not a moment that would resolve here. Not in this light, not at this table. The consequence had already begun moving somewhere else, quieter, slower, but inevitable. She turned slightly, stepping toward the service corridor, the warmth of the dining room fading behind her as cooler air met her skin. The sound of voices softened into a distant hum, and for the first time since she had spoken, she allowed herself a small exhale. Not relief, not regret, just acceptance. Because she knew what came next would not arrive with laughter or polished words, it would arrive in numbers, in silence, in the kind of calls that came too early in the morning and ended too quickly, and somewhere behind her, at a table still glowing under perfect light, a decision had already been made that would begin to undo everything it was meant to protect. The service corridor swallowed the last trace of music as the door eased shut behind her, and the silence that followed was colder, sharper, real in a way the dining room never was. Ava set the tray down on the stainless steel counter, the faint echo of glass meeting metal ringing longer than it should have, her hands steady even as her mind replayed the conversation line by line, not searching for doubt, but confirming what she already knew. Timing, structure, delayed exposure, it was all there, too deliberate to be accidental. Down the hall, a kitchen worker called out an order. Another replied, the rhythm of routine continuing without pause. Because places like this did not stop for warnings, they moved forward, always forward, regardless of what was coming. Ava reached for a folded towel, wiping a spot that did not need cleaning, more out of habit than necessity, when the door behind her opened again. Slower this time, not the quick swing of staff, but a measured push. She did not turn immediately, but she felt it, the shift in presence, the way the air adjusted when someone who did not belong in the back stepped into it. "You should not have said that." A voice came, quieter now, stripped of the room it had filled minutes ago. Ava turned then, meeting Richard Halston not across a table, but in the narrow space between function and invisibility. He stood just inside the doorway, jacket still perfectly in place, but something in his posture less certain, not weakened, just less absolute, like a structure tested by a force it had not accounted for. "And you should not ignore it," she replied, her tone even, not challenging, not apologizing, simply stating. He exhaled slowly, glancing once toward the closed door as if measuring how far this conversation could exist without consequence. "You are making assumptions about a deal you do not have full access to," he said, stepping closer, each movement controlled, deliberate. "You heard fragments, not the full architecture." Ava held his gaze, unshaken. "I heard enough," she said. "Enough to know the risk does not disappear. It just waits." The fluorescent lights above cast a different kind of clarity on both of them. No warmth, no softness, just sharp edges and honest shadows. Richard studied her for a moment longer than before, not dismissing now, but evaluating in a different way, as if recalculating where she fit into a system he had already defined. If what you were suggesting were true, he said slowly, my legal team would have flagged it. Ava shook her head slightly. Only if they were looking for it in the right place, she replied. It is not written like a risk. It is written like protection, and that is why it works. A silence followed, not the polite kind from the table, but something heavier, something that pressed inward instead of outward. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, not yet, but resistance, the kind that came when certainty began to shift but pride refused to move with it. You are overstepping, he said finally, the words softer but no less firm. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the silence hold, let it stretch just enough to make the next words matter. Maybe, she said, but I would rather overstep now than watch it collapse later. The sentence did not rise, did not push. It simply settled between them, undeniable in its calm. Richard looked at her then, really looked, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the stillness behind it, and for the first time that night, there was no immediate response, no quick dismissal, just a pause, brief but real, before he turned slightly, his hand resting against the doorframe as if deciding whether to stay or leave. And in that moment of hesitation, something unspoken passed through the space, not agreement, not yet, but the faintest recognition that the warning he had ignored was no longer as easy to dismiss as it had been under the warm light of the table. Richard's hand remained on the doorframe for a second too long, the silence between them stretching into something neither of them could fully control, and then he stepped back, not abruptly, not defeated, just enough to re-establish distance, the kind of distance that preserved authority even when certainty had begun to thin. We close the deal tomorrow morning, he said, his voice returning to that familiar, measured calm. At 9:30, everything is reviewed, everything is cleared. Ava watched him, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening the way she had learned to do in rooms where speaking too soon erased the impact of truth. And if you are wrong, he continued, a slight edge returning, then you have disrupted a room you were not even supposed to be in. Ava nodded once, accepting the weight of that without hesitation. And if I am right, she replied quietly, then you will wish I had said more. The words landed without force, but carried something heavier than challenge, something closer to inevitability. Richard's jaw tightened again, not visibly to most, but enough for someone watching closely. Enough for someone who understood that control was not about volume. It was about maintaining the illusion that nothing unexpected could touch you. You are confident, he said, not as a compliment, more as an observation that needed to be placed somewhere. Ava did not smile, did not soften. I am certain, she answered, and the distinction between the two hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Confidence could be dismissed, certainty demanded attention. Even if it was refused, Richard looked at her for another moment, longer this time, as if searching for something he had not yet decided how to define, not her role, not her presence, but the origin of that certainty, because it did not come from arrogance, it came from understanding, and that was harder to ignore. Where did you learn to read contracts like that? He asked suddenly, the question slipping out before it could be filtered into something more appropriate. Ava hesitated for the first time, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the cost of giving it. I studied finance, she said finally, her voice still steady. Before I had to stop. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, recalibrating again, fitting new information into an old framework that was beginning to strain. And now you carry trays, he said, not cruelly, but with the blunt clarity of someone used to defining people by their current position. Ava did not react to the reduction. She had heard worse. Now I pay bills, she replied. Simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. The fluorescent light above flickered once, briefly, casting a momentary shadow across both of them. And in that flicker, something shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to unsettle the clean lines of the moment. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before returning to her. This is not your responsibility, he said, softer now, almost as if he were trying to place the weight somewhere else. Ava shook her head slightly. No, she agreed. It is not. And then, after a pause just long enough to matter. But you heard it anyway. The sentence did not accuse. It did not demand. It simply existed as a fact neither of them could undo. Somewhere beyond the door, a glass clinked. Laughter rose again, distant, disconnected from the quiet tension in the corridor. Richard straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket with a small, practiced motion that restored the image he carried into every room. The billionaire, the decision-maker, the man who did not hesitate. And yet, before he turned away, there was one last look, brief, searching, almost unwilling. 9:30, he repeated, more to himself than to her, as if anchoring the timeline in something solid, something predictable, something he could still control. And then he stepped back through the doorway, the warm light swallowing him again, the door closing with a soft, final click that left Ava alone in the colder air, the hum of the kitchen returning, steady, indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But in the quiet space he left behind, the certainty remained, not louder, not heavier, just unchanged, waiting for a moment that was already moving closer with every passing second. The night ended without resolution, without raised voices or dramatic shifts, just the quiet continuation of something already set in motion. And by the time Ava stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain against concrete and city lights stretching across the skyline in distant reflections. She stood still for a moment near the service exit, the hum of traffic low and constant, headlights sliding past like silent reminders that the world never paused for a single decision. She replayed the conversation once more, not with doubt, but with precision, each word, each pause, each look, fitting together like a structure she had already seen collapse before. And yet there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of being proven right, only the weight of knowing that what came next could not be stopped, not by her, not anymore, somewhere high above, behind glass walls and controlled lighting. The meeting continued in smaller conversations, reassurances, passed between voices that needed stability more than truth. Richard Halston moved through them with the same composed presence, shaking hands, confirming timelines, reinforcing the certainty that had built his empire piece by piece. But something had followed him out of that corridor, subtle, almost invisible, a question that did not belong in rooms where answers were expected, and though no one spoke it aloud, it lingered in the slight hesitation before a signature, in the extra glance at a document that had already been approved, in the delayed response to a message that should have been immediate. And as the night stretched forward, that hesitation did not disappear. It settled, waiting, just as the clause Ava had described waited, quiet, patient, designed not to disrupt the moment, but to redefine what came after it. Miles away, in a small apartment lit by a single lamp, Ava sat at a narrow table with a notebook open in front of her, lines drawn carefully across the page, reconstructing what she had heard from memory, not because she needed proof, but because she needed clarity. Her pen moved slowly, deliberate, tracing the sequence of events that would follow once the deal was signed. Public reporting, delayed exposure, legal transfer. The pattern was there, undeniable. And as she reached the final line, she paused, the tip of the pen hovering just above the paper, the outcome already written in a way no contract could reverse. She set the pen down gently, her hands still, her breathing even. There was nothing more to add, nothing more to change. Outside, a distant siren rose and faded, swallowed by the city, and back in the glass tower where decisions were sealed with quiet confidence, a digital clock moved forward by seconds that no one noticed, carrying the night toward a morning that would arrive exactly on time. 9:30, just as promised, and somewhere between those seconds, between the certainty of now and the consequence of what came next, the collapse had already begun. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with something far more dangerous, something no one at that table had truly accounted for. The simple, irreversible fact that they had been warned and chose not to listen. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, the conference room on the 32nd floor felt colder than it had the night before, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence that settled in before anything had even gone wrong. The kind of silence that came from expectation, from confidence rehearsed and repeated, until it felt like fact. Richard Halston stood at the head of the table, sleeves crisp, expression composed. Every detail aligned with the image he had spent years perfecting. The documents lay neatly arranged in front of him, each page reviewed, each clause approved, signatures waiting where they were meant to fall. And yet, as his hand hovered just above the paper, there was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second that did not belong in a moment like this, because hesitation was not part of his process, not part of his success. And yet it was there, small but undeniable, like a whisper he could not fully silence. Across the table, executives exchanged glances, subtle, controlled, no one daring to interrupt, because interruption implied uncertainty, and uncertainty did not exist in rooms built on authority. "Everything is in order," his legal advisor confirmed, voice steady, practiced, reinforcing the structure that had already been accepted. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if the motion itself could erase the brief disruption in his focus. He reached for the pen, the weight of it familiar, grounding, and for a moment, everything returned to what it should have been, predictable, controlled, inevitable. The tip touched the paper, ink met surface, and the deal was sealed. The room exhaled collectively, tension dissolving into quiet satisfaction. Hands were shaken, smiles returned, voices rose again in measured tones that spoke of success, of expansion, of what would come next. But beneath that surface, something else had already begun, unnoticed at first, buried in the fine print and delayed by design. The first call came just under 48 hours later, not urgent, not alarming, just a question from a junior analyst about a reporting discrepancy that did not quite align with projections. It was passed upward, reviewed quickly, dismissed as a timing issue, something that would resolve itself within the next cycle. But it did not resolve. It shifted, growing slightly more complex, slightly harder to explain. Another call followed, then another, each one small, each one manageable on its own, but together forming a pattern that did not fit within the expectations set at that table. Richard sat in his office, the city stretching out behind him in perfect lines of glass and steel, his phone resting just slightly heavier in his hand than usual, his gaze fixed on the numbers that no longer aligned the way they should. "Walk me through it again," he said, his voice controlled, but tighter now, less fluid than before. On the other end, a voice hesitated, not from lack of knowledge, but from the growing awareness that the explanation was no longer sufficient. "The exposure appears to be transferring as outlined in the secondary clause," the analyst said carefully. "But it is happening sooner than projected." Richard's jaw tightened, the words settling into place with a clarity he did not want. Sooner than projected, not unexpected, not impossible, just earlier than the model had accounted for. And in that slight shift of timing, everything began to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that mirrored the way it had been built, one number at a time, one assumption breaking just enough to reveal what had always been there, waiting, patient, inevitable. And as Richard stood there, staring at the screen that reflected both his empire and the first visible cracks within it, a memory surfaced, uninvited but impossible to ignore, a voice in a quiet corridor, steady, certain. "It does not disappear. It just waits." And for the first time since the deal had been signed, the certainty that had defined him began to shift into something else, something colder, something heavier, something that felt very much like the beginning of understanding. The numbers did not crash all at once. They shifted, quietly at first, then with a weight that could no longer be explained away. Projections that once aligned began to drift. Reports that should have confirmed stability now carried inconsistencies that required longer explanations. And each explanation led to another question that no one in the room could answer with the same confidence they had just days before. Richard stood at the head of a different table now, not polished with celebration, but layered with printouts, screens glowing, with data that refused to cooperate. Voices filled the space, faster, sharper, no longer measured for impression but driven by urgency. "The liability transfer is accelerating," one executive said, tapping a section of the document that had been reviewed countless times. "It is triggering earlier than modeled," another added, flipping through pages that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the words had changed overnight. Richard listened, his posture still controlled, but the stillness now carried tension, not authority. It should not behave like this, someone insisted, more to themselves than to him. And that was the problem. It was behaving exactly as it had been written, just not as they had chosen to understand it. Richard stepped closer to the screen, his reflection faint against the shifting numbers, his mind running through the sequence again. The meeting, the signatures, the reassurance, and then the interruption. The voice he had dismissed because it did not belong, because it did not fit the structure he trusted. "Walk me through the clause," he said, his voice lower now, not commanding, but focused. The room quieted. A senior analyst stepped forward, hesitating only briefly before speaking. "The exposure is deferred beyond the initial reporting window, but the trigger conditions are broader than we accounted for. Once activated, the transfer compounds across multiple segments." The explanation landed heavy, not because it was new, but because it was now undeniable. Richard closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in defeat, but in recalibration, and in that brief darkness, the memory returned again, clearer this time, not just the words, but the tone, the certainty behind them. "It is written like protection," she had said, "but it is not." His eyes opened, sharper now, but not with the same confidence as before. This was something else, something closer to recognition. "How long before this becomes visible externally?" he asked, the question cutting through the noise with a different kind of weight. The analyst swallowed slightly. "It already is, just not widely," he replied. "Another cycle, maybe less, and it will hit the public filings." The room shifted, the implications settling in, not just internal loss, but exposure, scrutiny, the kind that did not stay contained within glass walls. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting now, not dismissing, just seeing it for what it was, a consequence that had been outlined before it ever began. And in that moment, the power in the room changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Because control depended on certainty, and certainty had been replaced with something far more difficult to manage, the truth. He turned away from the screen, his gaze moving toward the window where the city stretched out exactly as it had the day before, unchanged, indifferent, and for a moment, he stood there in silence, the weight of everything settling into something simple, something unavoidable. He had been warned, clearly, precisely, without hesitation, and he had chosen not to listen, not because the warning was unclear, but because of who delivered it. The realization did not come with anger. It came with something quieter, something heavier, the kind of understanding that arrived too late to change the outcome, but just in time to make it undeniable. And as the room behind him continued to move, to calculate, to attempt control over something already unfolding, Richard Halston stood still, not as the man who commanded every outcome, but as the one who now understood exactly when he had lost it. The city did not stop for his realization. Traffic moved, lights changed, people crossed streets with the same rhythm as always, and inside the glass tower, the movement continued as well, but it felt different now, not slower, not quieter, just heavier. Like every action carried a weight that had not been there before. Richard turned from the window and walked back toward the table, the voices dimming as he approached, not out of fear, but out of awareness that something had shifted in him, something that no longer aligned with the version of control they had all relied on. "We contain what we can," he said, his voice steady, but stripped of the effortless certainty it once carried. "And we prepare for what we cannot." The room nodded, not in confidence, but in necessity, because at this point, there was no alternative. The process moved forward, damage control, adjustments, strategies designed to slow what could not be reversed. And yet, even as the room worked, Richard's mind was somewhere else, not in the numbers, not in the projections, but in a narrow corridor under fluorescent light, in a moment he had chosen to step away from rather than step into. Hours later, long after the meetings had ended and the building had quieted, he stood once again, outside that same service door, the city night stretching behind him, colder now, sharper, the memory clearer than it had been before. He pushed the door open, the hinge moving with a soft, familiar resistance, and stepped inside. The corridor unchanged, the same light, the same stillness, but she was not there. The counter was clean, the trays stacked, the space returned to its usual anonymity. He stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, as if expecting something to remain, some trace of the moment that had altered everything. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of a place that did not hold on to people once they left it. He exhaled slowly, his gaze moving across the empty space, not searching now, just acknowledging, because he understood something he had not before, that the moment to listen had already passed, and it would not return. The next morning, the reports were worse, the exposure clearer, the consequences spreading beyond internal containment. But Richard did not react the way he might have before. There was no denial left, no instinct to override what was already unfolding, only the steady acceptance of a truth he could no longer reshape. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment with a single lamp and a notebook left open on a narrow table, Ava Brooks sat in the quiet, the world outside continuing as it always had, unchanged by the decision she had witnessed. She did not watch the news, did not follow the numbers, because she already knew the outcome, not in detail, not in percentages or reports, but in principle, in the